I'm Lenora Wynn, and I was 74 the morning my children voted in my living room to move me somewhere more manageable. They didn't call it a vote. Dennis called it a conversation. There were 3 of them plus Carol, and there was a brochure and a notebook with nothing written in it yet, and the conclusion had been reached before any of them came through the door, so I will call it what it was. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to. I had set out 4 cups of coffee, habit, partly, and the small ceremony of doing a thing the same way long enough that stopping would feel like an admission you weren't ready to make. Chester had been dead 19 years. I still reached for a 5th cup sometimes before catching myself, that kind of muscle memory that grief carves into a person without asking. For cups was right that morning. My children were coming, and I intended to do everything the way I always did it. Good cups, the almond cake on the stand I'd had since before Patty was born, the living room tidied, the couch cushions squared. Nothing scattered that could be pointed to later, because I had spent 30 years in front of classrooms and I knew what it looked like when someone arranged evidence. Dennis arrived first with Carol. Carol was wearing her good coat. Carol's good coat was dove gray wool, reserved for occasions that required a certain quality of gravitas. School conferences. The meeting at the estate attorney's office when Dennis's father-in-law died. The time she and Dennis had come to tell me they were pulling the grandchildren from the local school district and enrolling them across the county. I had seen that coat often enough to understand its significance before she settled into the armchair and folded it across her lap. It meant she had decided. This was not a conversation to be had. It was a presentation to be delivered, with a predetermined start and a predetermined end, and the exchange between those 2 points was going to travel exactly where she had already marked the destination. Patty came 10 minutes after Dennis, carrying the apologetic quality she wore into rooms she'd been summoned to rather than chosen. She kissed my cheek, took the cup nearest her, and sat on the far end of the couch from Carol, which told me she had been given less of the planning than she was being asked to stand behind. Patty had always been that way. She could be recruited to positions she hadn't fully examined if the recruiting came from someone she found it easier to agree with, and Dennis was her older brother, and Carol was Carol, and Patty had spent her life finding the path of least friction and calling it keeping things smooth. Kevin came last, road-tired, with a gas station coffee already in hand. He kissed my cheek properly and looked around the room with the slow reading attention he brought to spaces, and he said the azaleas looked good from the drive. I told him Chester's azaleas always knew when to show up. He laughed, a real one, unpracticed, the kind that sounds like it came from somewhere other than the surface. Then the room changed in the way it changes when the last person has arrived and there is nothing left to wait for. Dennis had a notebook on his knee. He had written nothing in it and would write nothing. The notebook was not for writing. It was for looking like a man who had organized something, and that had been Dennis's role in family moments since he was about 12 and decided that being the oldest meant being in charge of the difficult conversations. Chester used to say that Dennis had grown into his certainties so fast he never had time to check whether they fit. He said it with affection. He had loved Dennis in the way you love a child who has your stubbornness and none of your patience. Chester himself had been a patient man. Not passive, the word patient gets confused with passive and they are nothing alike. He was a mechanical engineer by training who worked for the County Public Works Department for 31 years, the kind of work that required you to understand systems and timelines and what happened when you forced a thing before it was ready. He had brought that understanding home. When one of the children needed something difficult addressed, he would sit with them at the kitchen table until they had said all of it, every corner and complaint and fear, before he said a word back. I had watched him do it with Dennis the summer Dennis was 17 and convinced the world had arranged itself specifically to obstruct him. Chester sat at that table for 2 hours. He did not argue. He just waited until Dennis had run out of momentum, and then he said 3 sentences, and Dennis was quiet after that in a way he hadn't been before. I had tried to learn that quality. I had gotten reasonably good at a version of it. I was about to use it. If you are going to understand what happened in that living room and everything that came after it, you need to understand some things about me that my children, in their good faith and genuine worry and occasional self-interest, had never thought to ask about. Not because the information was hidden from them, because asking would have required a curiosity about who I was beyond the fact of being their mother, and children are allowed their blind spots about parents, At least until the blind spots cost them something. I taught 5th grade for 30 years at Hartfield Elementary, and I was good at it, the kind of good where children remembered you 20 years later and brought their own kids to say hello. Chester and I raised 3 children in the house on Birchwood Lane with the efficiency of 2 people who agreed on most things and were direct about the ones they didn't. He died at 56, a cardiac event, in the garage on a September afternoon with the door open to the good weather and a particular wrench he'd been looking for on the bench in front of him. He had found the wrench. He was holding it when I found him. I have never moved that wrench from the place where it lay. I went back to teaching the following spring. Everyone said it was too soon. I knew it was the right time because I had 35 students who needed long division and the conjugation of irregular verbs, and nobody else was going to be responsible for them. Useful work is one of the gifts you can give yourself in grief, and I took it without reservation. 4 years later, I retired at 60 and settled into the quieter logistics of what came next. Grief has a known shape, a literature, a trajectory. Being a woman alone at 60 with a pension and a house and a future entirely unscripted had none of those things and asked harder questions. You wake up one morning and the grief hasn't gone anywhere, but it has rearranged itself. The way furniture looks different once you move one piece and discover the room was always larger than you thought. My mother died the year after I retired and left me a modest inheritance. Not transformative money in the sense the word usually means, but real. Along with the insurance from Chester's death and the pension I had kept in reasonable shape, I was a woman in her early 60s with a measure of financial independence and the question of what to point it at. I had been an investor in a small way for years, the way careful people are, index funds and certificates, the machinery of prudence. Investing had never interested me as a practice. What interested me was the thing that investing was supposed to accomplish. What could this resource become if it were aimed at something real? The answer came from Patty's broken ankle. She broke it the October of that year, and I drove her to the rehabilitation facility across the county twice a week, while she did her sessions. Observation was something I had practiced for 30 years as a profession. I could not sit in a room without reading it. And what I read in that facility over 6 weeks of sitting in the family waiting area was a room full of people receiving adequate care, which is a specific thing different from good care, and the difference lived in 100 small choices that each cost less than people assumed. The gap between those two standards, adequate and good, added up to the entire distance between a place that holds a person and a place that helps them. The staff were not unkind. They were stretched thin, the way staff are when the funding has been cut to the boundary of what is possible and the work goes on regardless. The spaces were institutional in a way that a modest investment of care would have addressed, not money necessarily, though some of that too, but attention. I watched an elderly man wait 40 minutes for help moving his chair to the window where the afternoon light was better. I watched a woman do the same puzzle in the same corner for 4 consecutive visits, alone. I watched meals delivered with technical adequacy and no particular warmth. The aides were doing what they had been hired to do. What was missing was not effort but the orientation of it, the difference between a place designed to process residents and a place designed to serve them. A teacher has a word for this distinction. It shows up in classrooms constantly. Some teachers are managing the class and some are teaching the students in it, and the children know the difference before they have language for it. The residents in that facility knew the difference too. I could see it in how they held themselves in the common room, the particular self-contained quality of people who have learned not to expect much from the space they're in. I started asking questions. Specific ones, the kind a teacher asks because the answer to a vague question is always vague. I asked the administrator about ownership structures in senior care, about investment models, about the regulatory environment and what a private investor would need to know. He was flattered by the specificity of my interest and more forthcoming than he probably needed to be. I went home and started reading county records, facility assessments, state licensing documentation, business filings in the senior care sector. I read the way I used to prepare to teach a subject I hadn't taught before, which was to read until the shape of the thing became clear from more than one direction. 3 months later I drove a county road I'd taken 100 times and passed a shuttered building sitting on 12 acres, a former convalescent home closed 4 years prior, with a bank notice on the fence line. I pulled over. I wrote down the phone number on the notice. Called it. James Hobart answered. His firm's name was on the notice and he was the one who would know whether what I was thinking was a thing that could be done. I told him I was calling about the property. He asked what I had in mind. I told him I was thinking about a senior living facility, that the bones of the building looked right from the road, that the land had the quality of space I had been thinking about. He asked me to tell him more about the capital situation. I told him what I had. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he knew an architect, a contractor, and a woman who might be exactly the right director of operations, and that if I was serious we should take a drive before either of us said anything more. We drove out on a cold Friday in November with the leaves down and the sky close and low. I stood in the field behind the building for a long time before I said anything. The brick was original and well made, the kind that was built to outlast the people who specified it. The 12 acres had the quality of a place that had been something and had the capacity to become something again. A red oak stood at the southwest corner where the road curved, large and settled, the kind of tree that had been growing long enough to have earned its ground. James Hobart stood beside me and did not hurry me. That was the first thing I trusted about him. He understood that some decisions happen at their own pace and that the right work in those moments is to have prepared the conditions clearly and then stand aside while a person thinks. I had spent 40 years in rooms with people who rushed you through the important things because they had somewhere else to be. James had nowhere more important to be than that cold field. I told him I wanted to buy the property. He asked what I wanted to call the trust. I said Wynn Heritage. Chester's name. My name. What we had built. He nodded once and said we would get started. The Wynn Heritage Trust was established over the weeks that followed, organized with the meticulousness that James brought to everything, the kind that satisfies. Even a schoolteacher's eye for done correctly. The trust held the property. The trust funded the renovation, which took 14 months and went over budget twice in ways that were honest and structural and that I approved without regret. The trust contracted with a senior care management company, and through them came Sandra Lim, who had run 2 facilities in the southern part of the state, and was ready for something she could build from the beginning, rather than inherit someone else's unfinished problems. The first time I met Sandra, she shook my hand in the conference room of a law firm downtown, looked at me for a moment with the direct appraisal she gave everything and said, "Tell me your vision for this place. Not what services it would offer. Not the financial model. The vision." I told her. I told her about sitting in Patty's rehabilitation facility twice a week and watching what adequate looked like from the inside, about the man waiting for the window, about the woman with the puzzle in the corner, about the meals delivered with technical correctness and no warmth at all. I told her I wanted to build the opposite of that. She asked 2 specific follow-up questions, both of them sharper than I expected, and then she said she was in, that she had been waiting for something like this, and that she needed 6 months to disentangle from her current position. I told her 6 months was fine. I had been waiting 20 years to ask the right person the right question. 6 months was nothing. She was true to her timeline, which told me everything I needed to know about how she would run the operation. She arrived ready and she started immediately and she made decisions well. When she came to me with questions, they were the right questions, the ones where the decision genuinely needed to be mine, rather than the ones she could have answered herself if she had been less rigorous about the chain of authority. Working with Sandra was one of the cleaner professional relationships I had in my life. I chose the tile for the main hall from a sample book. I approved the paint color, the third of 4 options Sandra presented, because you could see it was right. I chose the plants for the entrance walk, the pale yellow variety, because Chester had liked yellow and the catalog had it right there. During the renovation, I drove out on a Tuesday morning and walked through the raw spaces, the exposed framing, the new windows being fitted, and I stood in what would become the common room and looked at where the view to the grounds would be, and I understood that everything was going to become what I had been thinking about. Sandra suggested the framed history display in the east hallway the year after opening, photographs and context. She called it grounding, giving residents and families a sense of the place having a real story rather than appearing ready-made. I had approved it. The caption she wrote read, "Established through the Wynn Heritage Trust, the building was restored and opened as Cloverfield Senior Living in partnership with the county's Senior Services Board." My name was not on it directly. The trust's name was, and the trust's name was mine, but connecting those 2 things required someone to have thought to ask. Cloverfield Senior Living opened 17 years ago on a Tuesday in late spring. 80 beds. 12 acres. The red oak standing where it had always stood. I had a room available when I needed to be there, which was 6 or 8 times a year. The staff knew me as Mrs. Wynn. Sandra reported quarterly to the trust. James held every document in a fire-safe 7 miles from my front door. My children knew I had some investments. I had mentioned it once years earlier in the context of estate planning none of them wanted to discuss at length. Dennis said that sounded smart. Kevin asked if it was complicated. Patty said she was glad I had something to occupy my time. I had not pushed the subject further, not because I was hiding anything exactly, but because the worth of a thing is not diminished by keeping it private. Chester had been that kind of man. I had learned it from him, and from 30 years of knowing that the children who needed to announce everything were still working out what they believed. So Cloverfield had run and grown for 17 years, and my children had never thought to ask and I had never thought to tell them. Until Dennis arrived with Carol in her good coat, and a brochure with my flower beds on the cover. Dennis opened with the stove. October, a small pot of water for tea, left on the burner when Patty called about something at her dentist office, the kind of minor nothingness Patty called about with complete good faith because she had never fully learned to sort information by actual importance. I had been on the phone 11 minutes and came back to find the element glowing and the pot dry. Nothing had caught. I opened the window and thought nothing more of it until that moment in my living room, when Dennis laid it on the table like an exhibit. Betsy Crane next door had apparently smelled something and knocked and called Dennis. Betsy had been quietly worried about me since Chester died, in the way kind women sometimes transfer their anxious care onto widowed neighbors. She meant well. I held nothing against her. Dennis mentioned the dizzy spell at church. Real enough, I had stood too fast in a warm room after a short night and my blood pressure had done exactly what blood pressure does in those conditions. I had sat down. Someone had brought water. I was fine in 5 minutes. Someone had told someone who had told Carol, and the two incidents had been assembled into a pattern and the pattern had been assembled into a case and the case had been assembled into a notebook and a brochure and a Thursday morning. Dennis laid these two things out with care, the measured deliberateness of a person who has had time to rehearse. He said he knew this was difficult. He said they all loved me. He said they wanted what was best. Then Carol slid a brochure across the coffee table. The cover photograph showed the main face of Cloverfield in late afternoon light with the flower beds along the entrance walk, the pale yellow variety I had chosen 3 springs ago after Sandra sent me a catalog and said what did I think about the exterior planting. Those were my flower beds on the brochure Carol was presenting to me as the solution to the problem of my life. I looked at that brochure for a moment without picking it up. Patty was watching me with the expression she'd had since she was a child, when she was waiting to understand what something was going to cost. Kevin was looking at his coffee. Carol was explaining the amenities and staff ratios and the activities programming with the ease of someone who had done the research and was pleased with what she'd found. She had found the best facility in the county and she was right about that, and I did not plan to tell her why. Dennis said this wasn't a decision exactly, just a conversation. Something to think about. I asked who had voted. He stopped. All of us, he said. We discussed it. On the call last weekend? I said. He shifted slightly. Yes, they had all been on a call. The Sunday call he had not mentioned to me was a conference among himself and Carol and Patty and Kevin, reaching a conclusion about my life in my absence and presenting it to me as a conversation already in progress. I had seen this technique before, in my professional life and outside it, the conclusion delivered in the place where the conversation is supposed to live, and the people around the table let it stand because objecting requires more energy than proceeding. I recognized it the way you recognize a particular kind of weather. I said, "Tell me more about Cloverfield." Carol sat forward. I listened for 23 minutes. The clock on the mantel was visible from my side of the couch. Carol described the staff ratios and the activities calendar, and the physical therapy on site. Dennis added facts she had given him in advance, the practiced relay of 2 people who had worked through this together. Patty nodded at specific points. Kevin looked at the space between the coffee table and the window with the particular attending absence of a man who has agreed to something he is still sorting out how he feels about. 3:10 Dennis said, "So what do you think?" I told them I appreciated their thinking it through. I told them I wanted to see the place in person before I said anything further. On my own first and then we could all go together. Carol said that was very sensible. I said I would let them know. They left at 4:15. The house was still after them in the specific way a space settles when something has been set in motion that cannot be called back. I stood in the kitchen and looked at the cups on the table. 3 of them still half full. Kevin had finished his. That told you something about Kevin. He always finished what was in front of him. I thought about what Dennis had said near the end of his presentation. He had said, and I want to get this exactly right because I have thought about it many times since, he had said, we just want to make sure you're somewhere that can take care of you, Mom. In case something happens. The phrase "in case something happens" is one of the most interesting phrases in the English language. It is technically about the future, but it is really about the fear that belongs to the present. I had used it with my own students when I was trying to prepare them for something I knew was coming without wanting to frighten them. Dennis had learned it somewhere. He had learned a lot of things without knowing he had learned them. I stood in the kitchen and looked at Chester's window. I thought about the stove, the boil-dry pot. I thought about the dizzy spell, the woman with the water. I thought about Betsy Crane knocking on my door with her careful eyes and her genuine worry. Because Betsy's worry was genuine, I had never doubted that. I thought about Patty driving past on her way home from work. These were acts of love, all of them. Imperfect, misguided in their conclusions, operating from a set of assumptions that were about to be corrected. But love underneath. I had taught long enough to know that the most common mistake people make about someone they're worried about is to confuse the worry with wisdom. The worry is real. The conclusion the worry leads to is sometimes wrong. That evening I stood in my kitchen and held both of those things at once, which is what 20 years of careful planning and 30 years in a classroom prepares you to do. I called James Hobart that evening. He answered on the second ring, which was how James always answered. Not hurried, just present. The voice of a man who had managed his attentiveness well enough over a long career to have some reliably left. The roads between my house and the facility had been mine for 17 years and the drive required no thought. Just the familiar sequence of turns on county roads. I knew the way you know a thing practiced long enough it lives in your hands rather than your head. I parked in the visitor section and walked to the entrance the way any visitor would. The woman at the front desk recognized me before I said anything. She said, "Mrs. Wynn," the end of it lifting into a question about what she was supposed to do with the context. I said hello. Could I see Sandra? Sandra came from the back offices in her practical way, no ceremony, a woman who moved toward things rather than waiting for them to arrive. She stopped when she saw me. Something moved across her face, a rapid internal reclassification. Then she said my name and looked at me with the careful expression of someone who has received new information and is still deciding where to file it. I said I was here to look at the residential wing. As a visitor. She understood without anything more needing to be said. She led me through the afternoon hall. The tile was the warm gray I had approved from a sample book 6 years back. The paint was the sage I had chosen when Sandra offered 4 options, and I said the third without much deliberation because it was plainly right. The photographs along the main corridor were from the County Historical Society's rotating collection, a program Sandra had proposed 2 years prior during a quarterly call, and I had said yes, good, that's a good idea. The common room had its enlarged windows looking onto the grounds. The windows I had asked to be made larger because Sandra had shown me the original construction plans and said the residents in this wing barely see sun from October through March, and I had looked at the drawing for less than a minute before saying take the wall back and put in larger casings. I walked through the space as a prospective resident and let myself understand what it was like from the other side of the choosing. The common room had the quality I had spent 2 years of design conversations trying to create, which is the quality of a space that belongs to the people inside it rather than the building around them. James had said once that I had a gift for understanding the difference between a facility and a home. I told him it was not a gift but a practice, built from 30 years of knowing what a classroom felt like when it had been made for the children and what it felt like when it had been made for the adults watching them. In the east hallway I stopped at the small framed history display. Sandra had installed it the year after opening. The black and white photograph of the building before renovation, boarded windows, the red oak visible in the background at the southwest corner. The caption in small serif type below. Established through the Wynn Heritage Trust, the building was restored and opened as Cloverfield Senior Living in partnership with the county's Senior Services Board. My name was not on it directly. The trust's name was, and the trust's name was mine, but connecting those two things required someone to have asked the question. My family would be walking past this panel in a matter of days. I stood at the display for a moment and then walked on. Sandra walked me to the parking lot in the thin October sun. Before I reached my car, she said, in a lower register, "Mrs. Wynn, you're going to let them move you in here?" I told her I was considering it. She looked at me with 17 years of working relationship behind her eyes. You designed this place for people who weren't going to be given a choice, she said. It was not an accusation. Just the fact of it placed between us. This is different, I told her. I am making the choice. That is the entire difference. She nodded once and let me go. I called James Hobart that evening. He answered on the second ring, which was how James always answered. Not hurried, just present. The voice of a man who had managed his attentiveness well enough over a long career to have some reliably left. James, I said. My family has found Cloverfield. A pause. Then, I had wondered if that might happen eventually. I gave him the shape of it. The meeting, the vote, the brochure with my flower beds on the cover, Sandra's question in the parking lot. He listened to all of it before he spoke, which had been his practice for 20 years. Letting the full shape of a thing arrive before responding to any part of it. Then he said, "What do you want to do?" Not what was advisable. Not what was legally possible. What did I want to do? That was the thing about James. He had understood from the first meeting that I was a person who had already done the thinking, and that his job was to organize the execution rather than supply the thinking itself. I want to let it run a few more weeks, I told him. He said to go carefully. I said I had been going carefully for 20 years. He said he would have everything organized and ready. Patty came by on Saturday with a pie dish she had borrowed in August. She tidied my kitchen while I made tea, her hands moving over the counter before she had fully decided to move them. She had been doing this lately, the small automatic managing of surfaces, as though the house itself needed tending. I watched her and felt the complicated texture of watching someone act from worry. She was not doing it badly. She was doing it in the language of care she had, which was the language of useful hands doing useful things because the larger, unspoken thing could not be addressed directly. She said, while rinsing the pie dish, that Cloverfield was very nice. She said she had looked at other options in the county and Cloverfield was clearly the best. Clearly meaning Carol had established this. Clearly meaning the decision had a shape that had been agreed to before Patty walked through my door. I asked what she thought. Not what Dennis had said or Carol had decided. What Patty thought. She turned from the sink with the clean dish in her hands, and looked at me with the look she had had since she was 11 years old when asked to separate her own opinion from the room's consensus. Then she said she just wanted me to be safe. She said sometimes she drove past on her way home from work to check that the lights were on. I had not known she was doing that. It stopped me in a way the brochure and the notebook and the good coat had not. My daughter driving past my house on her way home from a shift to check the lights. Patty, who called me for directions to places she had been 30 times and who had cried for 3 consecutive days when her cat died 5 years ago. Who had needed me in every small fundamental way that adult children need their mothers and had never thought the river of need ran in any other direction. My daughter was frightened of losing me the way I had been frightened of losing Chester. She was doing it imperfectly, all of them were, some more imperfectly than others, but underneath the imperfection was the same old human terror of watching someone you came from begin to leave. I looked at her with the clean pie dish in her hands and felt the full weight of the past 2 years in a different register. Not the mild impatience at Carol's calculations. Not the coolness of being voted on without being consulted. Something older and less manageable. My children were afraid. I poured more tea and asked Patty about the kids. She talked about them for 20 minutes. Her voice loosening as it always did when she shifted from what she was afraid of to what she loved. Her youngest had taken up cross-country. Her middle one had gotten a part in the school production. I listened and felt the evening settle around us into something worth holding. Kevin called Sunday morning. He did not lead with anything out of the ordinary. He asked about the faucet, whether I'd had it seen to. He asked about the azaleas for winter, whether I had mulched the beds yet. He asked if I was sleeping all right in the direct Kevin way, a simple question surrounded by nothing, the way he had asked questions since he was a child, never angling, never preliminary. I told him the faucet had been fine for a year. I told him the azaleas were done for the season and would come back in the spring the way they always did and did not require my intervention. I told him I was sleeping fine. Then he said, flat as a road on a clear day, "Mom, what is Wynn Heritage Trust?" I was standing at the kitchen counter with the phone and I felt the thing that happens when a plan you have built carefully reaches the moment it was built for. Something like a clock striking the exact hour you set it for, a clean and satisfying sound, the confirmation that the mechanism ran correctly. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases, because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now let's get back to the story. I said it was the name of a trust one had established for estate planning purposes. He was quiet for a moment. Then, it's on the wall at Cloverfield. In the history display in the east hallway. I told him yes, it was. He said, Mom, what did you invest in exactly? I told him I had made some investments after his father died that had done reasonably well over time. He said, You built Cloverfield. You founded it. I said the trust had been involved in its founding, yes. The silence stretched. Then, how much did you know when you let us choose it? Everything, I said. I heard him exhale. A long, controlled breath. Does Dennis know? He asked. I told him Dennis did not know. I told him Patty did not know. I told him Carol absolutely did not know, which was the part that mattered most in terms of what was going to happen next. Kevin was quiet for a stretch of time. I could hear wind in the background, the sound of a door. A man stepping somewhere with more room in it than the inside of a house. He had always needed air when he was thinking. He had been that way since he was a boy, the child who asked to go outside when he needed to work something through, while Dennis asked to be given a definitive answer and Patty asked to be reassured. Kevin just needed air and time. I had always respected that about him. Then he said, What are you planning? I told him I was planning to cooperate with their timeline. I told him my attorney had the documents organized and ready. Kevin, I said, I need you to say nothing to Dennis for a few more weeks. Can you do that? He said, Are you sure about this? I said I had been sure about it for 20 years. I just needed time for the rest of the sequence to complete itself. He was quiet again. Then he said, and I had not prepared for it, he said. Dad would have loved this. I stood in my kitchen and let that sit in me for a full breath before I answered. He would have, I said. You know how he was about a fair outcome. Kevin laughed, the same real laugh as when he had come in Thursday morning and said the azaleas looked good. The unpracticed one. He said he would drive up at the end of the month. I said good. Then I said, Kevin, thank you for not saying anything when you saw the caption. He said he had spent about 6 seconds deciding. I asked what decided it. He said, I looked at your face. I said goodnight and set the phone on the counter and stayed in my kitchen for a while without moving. The morning light was coming in at the October angle, the one that only appeared for 3 weeks a year when the sun was at the right place and the neighbor's maple had dropped enough leaves to let it through. Chester had noticed it the first October we were in the house. He had said hey and pointed, and we had stood there without saying anything watching the light on the floor. He stopped for light, Chester. He was that kind of person. My kitchen. His light. My plan. The family tour was Wednesday. I drove myself and arrived first, which I have done in all my life. Arrived first and found my bearing before the room fills. Dennis and Carol came together. Patty and Kevin came in the second car. Sandra met all of us at the entrance and led the tour with the full warmth and competence of a director who believed in what she was showing, because she had built it and she did. I watched them see it. Dennis's posture settling as the tour went well, the particular physical release of a man whose plan was producing the right results. Carol's eyes moving with the practiced instinct for value she brought to every room, calculating quietly, landing on numbers. Patty asking Sandra about the physical therapy program with genuine interest and Sandra answering her at full attention, the way Sandra answered everyone, which was completely. Kevin walking one pace behind the group the whole time, looking at things rather than performing the act of looking. In the east hallway, Kevin slowed at the frame display. He read the caption. He had already read it once. He stood there just slightly longer than a person stands at something that means nothing to them, long enough for the reading to take hold. Then he walked on. Sandra shook my hand last at the end of the tour, the same as everyone else's, with the same warmth she gave all of them. Her eyes stayed on mine for the space of a breath. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You're welcome," I told her. Outside in the parking lot, Dennis said the place felt right. He said it with the particular tone of a man whose project has come together. Carol said the timeline they had been considering was the end of the month. She said it the way she stated conclusions in the place where negotiations usually live, and the people around her let it stand because objecting required more than they wanted to spend. I said I would let them know. She said of course. On the drive home I thought about the house on Birchwood Lane. I thought about Carol's eyes on the room layouts during the tour, the slight mental measuring she did in every room. I thought about the call she had probably already placed to the real estate agents who had been circling the neighborhood. The Victorians on this street were drawing attention. She had mentioned it to me 2 months ago, casually, as a piece of information she thought I would find interesting, that the lot values on Birchwood had moved considerably. She had mentioned it with the neutrality of a person who wants you to understand something without being the one who said it out loud. 2 weeks before the Thursday meeting, Dennis had stopped by on a Saturday without calling first, which was unusual for Dennis, who scheduled things. He had walked through the downstairs the way people walk through spaces when they are imagining the spaces differently. He had stood in the front parlor for a moment longer than the conversation required. He had asked me if I found the house difficult to maintain now. I had said no, the house maintained itself. I had the same cleaning service I had used for 12 years and the yard work was handled. He had nodded and said it was a lot of space for one person. I had said Chester and I had bought it for a family and I had raised a family in it and it was exactly the right amount of space. He had let it go. But I had filed the visit. Carol was going to call an agent. She may have already called one. She was calculating the proceeds of a transaction she had no authority to execute, on a property she had no legal access to, and she did not know either of those things. The house on Birchwood Lane had been in the Wynn Heritage Trust for 12 years. It was not for sale. It was not part of any estate they could reach. James had recommended placing it in the trust a dozen years ago during a comprehensive review of the overall structure, for exactly the kind of reason that was now presenting itself. Carol was calculating the proceeds of a transaction she had no authority to execute, on a property she had no legal access to. She did not know this. I let her not know. There was no particular pleasure in it for me, and I want to be exact about that. I am not a person who enjoys watching others be wrong. I had spent 30 years teaching children that being wrong was not a punishment. It was information. It was what happened before understanding arrived. What Carol and Dennis were walking toward was going to be information. Eventually it would become understanding, and what came after understanding was their own business. The pleasure, if I name it honestly, was not in their being wrong. It was in my being right. In having built the right thing in the right order with the right people, and having had the patience to let it exist without explanation until the moment when its existence became the relevant fact. That was the thing. The completion of my own work rather than the undoing of someone else's plan. I called James Hobart on Monday, and told him we were getting close and asked him to have everything in order. He said it would be ready. He said go carefully. 20 years, James, I told him. I have it sorted. He laughed, the way he always laughed when I said that. The laugh of a man who has watched the work being done over a very long time and has no remaining doubt. I set the phone down and went to the kitchen and stood at Chester's window in the last of the October light. 3 weeks. The end of the month, Carol had said. I looked at the window itself for a moment. The specific window Chester had replaced in the second year because the original was drafty, because I had mentioned it twice, and the third time he simply got up and measured it and ordered the replacement without announcement. That was how he handled most things that needed handling. He just did them. He did not make them into presentations. He did not bring notebooks. The drawer for the pots was to my left, the one he'd installed after I told him 3 times that the cabinet arrangement made no sense. It was a deep drawer, well made. It ran smooth after 20 years because Chester had found the right hardware for it rather than the convenient hardware. He did most things that way. He found the right piece and he used it and the thing lasted. I thought that was what I had been trying to do for 20 years. Find the right piece. Use it correctly. Let it last. Cloverfield had lasted. The trust had lasted. James had lasted, a constant presence for 2 decades, the kind of professional relationship that becomes something closer to partnership over that kind of time. Sandra had lasted, had grown into the work and beyond it, had made Cloverfield something I could not have built alone. The house on Birchwood had lasted, solid in all its bones. The floors Chester had refinished the year Kevin was born. The staircase banister I had repainted twice in 40 years and intended to repaint again when the season was right. The thing about patience that nobody tells you is that practice long enough it stops feeling like waiting. It becomes the work continued in its right sequence, the next step of something you built carefully, done with the same quality of attention you brought to everything else. Each step preceded the next and the next preceded the one after that, and they were all going somewhere specific, toward a moment you had been building toward since a cold November morning in a field with a patient attorney and a red oak and a clear idea of what you wanted to make. All of it was mine. All of it was in order. All of it was documented. My children were 3 weeks from understanding what they had built their plan on top of. I was going to let every one of those days run. If you're just finding this story, I'm Lenora Wynn, and 3 weeks ago my children voted in my living room to move me somewhere more manageable. They chose Cloverfield Senior Living, the finest care facility in the county. What none of them knew was that I had founded it 17 years earlier, through a trust in my name, and that the house they were planning to sell was held by the same trust. I had agreed to move. I had said nothing. I had called my attorney, James Hobart, and told him to have everything ready. I called Dennis on a Tuesday morning and told him I had given it the thought it deserved, and that I would move to Cloverfield at the end of the month. He was quiet for a moment, the quiet of a man receiving better news than he had prepared for. Then he said good, that he was relieved that they would help with everything. I told him I did not need help with the move itself. I had a process in mind and I would let him know if anything was required. He said of course. He said Carol would want to know what she could do. I said I would call Carol when I was ready. His voice had the ease of a person whose plan has come together, and who has not yet had occasion to examine its foundations. I set the phone down and sat for a moment with the October light on my kitchen floor. Chester's light. 3 weeks a year when the angle was right and the maple had dropped enough. The last morning I would sit here with it. I had not been sentimental about the house for years. The house had always been a place rather than an attachment, but I found that morning that there is a difference between not being attached to a thing and not noticing when it changes. I had 5 weeks of ordinary October light left in this kitchen. I intended to sit in it each morning as I had for 40 years, and I intended to feel exactly what I felt, which was prepared. Chester's wrench stayed on the bench in the garage. I was not ready to decide what to do with it, and the house would hold it well enough until I was. The move took 3 days, which was how long it took a 74-year-old woman to decide what came with her, what went to storage, and what was finished. I was methodical about it. My own bedding, my lamp from the bedroom, the photograph of Chester and me from the first summer we were married, which had lived on every nightstand I'd had for 51 years. 2 boxes of books, my good dishes, the kitchen things I actually used. The almond cake stand. The second chair from the study, the smaller one because a person ought to have 2 chairs. Chester's reading chair I kept last, wrapping it myself, because I was not going to rush the moment when it left the room where it had been for 19 years. Sandra had assigned me the room I would have chosen. The east-facing room at the end of the south corridor, the one with the larger casements, the windows I had asked to be made larger during the renovation because the original opening was too small for the morning light that came from that direction. I had stood in that room 8 years earlier with the contractor and pointed at the wall and said take the opening back 12 inches on each side and raise the sill line. He had written it down and done exactly that. The casements were what I had specified, and the morning light came through them the way I had calculated it would. Sandra showed me the room with the manner of a director presenting a space to a new resident, courteous and warm and attentive. She said the east light in the morning was one of the things residents mentioned most often. I said I was glad to hear it. She met my eyes for a moment with the 17-year working relationship behind them. Then she said if I needed anything to let her know, and left me to settle. The first evening I sat in Chester's reading chair and looked at the room I had designed and felt the satisfaction of a thing completed correctly. The walls were the right color. The casements admitted the evening light cleanly. The room had the quality I had been building toward, which was the quality of belonging to the person in it. The staff were careful around me in a way that would have been noticeable to anyone paying the right kind of attention. The aides were warm and professional and perfectly ordinary in their manner. The management layer was different. The facilities manager, Roy, who had been with Cloverfield for 11 years, knocked on my door the third morning I was there to tell me the hot water pressure in the east corridor was lower than it should be, and that maintenance had been called, but he wanted me to know directly. He said it with the specific professional deference of someone who understands that certain information goes to certain people, and that I was one of those people. I thanked him and said I was sure it would be resolved promptly. He nodded with a quality I recognized as the response of a long-tenured employee to someone in authority, and left. Sandra had said something to the team. She had been professional and discreet about it, framing it in whatever language made sense for the context, but the team knew that Mrs. Wynn was more than a resident, and they were calibrating accordingly. I had not asked her to do this. She had done it because she was Sandra, and Sandra managed things correctly before she was asked to. Patty visited that first week on a Thursday afternoon, which was Patty doing what Patty did, showing up with flowers and good intentions and the particular gentle persistence of a woman who expresses love through presence. She walked through my room with the attentive eyes she used for spaces she was trying to form an opinion about. She said the light was really lovely. I said it was what the room was for. She sat in the second chair I had brought, the kitchen chair, and looked at me with the expression she'd worn since childhood when she was deciding whether to say a thing. She said the staff were very attentive. I agreed that they were excellent. She said more carefully, they seem to know you. I said I had toured the facility several times before moving in. She looked at me for a moment. She looked at my dishes on the shelf, my lamp, the photograph of Chester. She was putting something together in the slow way Patty assembled information, through feeling rather than analysis, arriving at conclusions from a different direction than Dennis, but sometimes arriving at the same place. She said, "Mom, is there something you're not telling us?" I told her there was quite a lot I hadn't told them, in the same way there is quite a lot any person has not told the people who know them. I told her everything she needed to know was going to become clear in the next few weeks. I reached over and took her hand and told her the place was good and that I was fine and that she should eat a piece of the almond cake on the counter because I had made it that morning for exactly this kind of visit. She ate 2 pieces and seemed better after that. Patty could usually be restored by something specific to do. Dennis and Carol had the key to the Birchwood house, the spare I had given Dennis years before for emergencies and not asked back. 3 days after I moved in, Carol called an agent. I knew this not because anyone told me but because of the texture of Carol's voice when she called to ask how I was settling in, and because of the specific question she folded into the conversation about whether I had taken most of my things from the house or left it substantially furnished. She asked the question in the tone of someone making conversation. It was not conversation. She was asking whether a real estate agent would walk into a staged house or a stripped one. I told her I had taken what I needed and the rest was as it had been. She said that was practical. The agent Carol called was a woman named Priscilla Moss from a firm that knew the older residential streets in the county, the Victorians and the Craftsman Foursquares that were drawing a particular kind of buyer now. I had seen their sold signs on Birchwood twice in the past 2 years. Priscilla Moss ran a title search in the first week, which was what good agents did, because good agents had been burned by surprises and had no intention of being burned again. The title search came back to the Wynn Heritage Trust. The trust, as listed in county records, was a revocable living trust, established by Lenora Margaret Wynn, trustee. The property at 412 Birchwood Lane had been transferred into the trust 12 years prior. It was not owned by an estate. It was not part of any jointly held property. It was held entirely by a trust with a living trustee whose name was on every document, whose address of record until 3 weeks ago had been 412 Birchwood Lane itself. Priscilla Moss called Carol. I do not know exactly what that conversation sounded like, but I understand its shape from what Carol did afterward. She called Dennis. He called Kevin, which was how I knew because Kevin texted me that evening with one sentence. Priscilla Moss found the trust. I sent back, I know. He sent. Dennis is making calls. I sent back, good. Dennis's calls went first to the county records office, which confirmed the trust filing without offering interpretation. He called his own attorney, a general practice man named Fielding who handled the family's basic estate documents, and asked what it meant that his mother's house was held in a trust. Fielding explained the basics of a revocable living trust, that it was common estate planning, that the trustee controlled the property, that if the trustee was living and of sound mind the property could not be sold without the trustee's explicit consent. Dennis asked who the trustee was. Fielding said it appeared to be Dennis's mother. Dennis drove to Cloverfield the following afternoon without calling. He arrived at 3 in the afternoon. I was in the common room reading when one of the aides came to tell me my son was at the front desk. I went out and met him in the lobby. He was dressed in the jacket over open collar way Dennis dressed when he wanted to look composed and prepared, and he had the expression he wore when he had worked out what he intended to say in advance. He did not greet me before he said, "Mom, what is the Wynn Heritage Trust?" I had heard this question once before from Kevin on a Sunday morning. Kevin had asked it with openness, the honest curiosity of someone who did not know the answer and genuinely wanted to. Dennis asked it with the tone of a man who had already arrived at a position, and was testing whether I would confirm it or give him something he would have to work with differently. I said it was a trust one had established for estate planning purposes. He said the house was in it. I said yes, it was. He said he had not known about this. I said there were many things about my financial arrangements he had not known about, and that was perfectly normal, as I had not known the details of his financial arrangements either. I said this without edge as plain fact because it was plain fact. He shifted. He said Carol had been talking to a real estate agent about the house. He said it the way people sometimes report their own decisions as things that happened to them, as though the decision belonged to someone else. I said I was aware of that. He looked at me with the expression I had been watching for 33 years when Dennis was faced with information that did not fit the frame he had been working from. The determined recalibration. The grip on the frame tightening rather than loosening. He said, "We thought the house would be available." I said I understood what they had assumed. He said more carefully, "Is it available?" I said that was a question for my attorney, James Hobart, and that Dennis should call the firm and make an appointment. I gave him the name. I said James was expecting to hear from the family and would be able to answer any questions they had, and that everything would become clear when they sat down with him. Dennis was quiet for a moment. He looked around the Cloverfield lobby, at the tile and the paint and the photographs on the wall, the warmth of the space he had chosen for me, and I watched the mild vertigo of a man beginning to understand that the situation he thought he understood is not the situation that exists. He said, "Mom, are you all right?" It was the first question he had asked me since the meeting in my living room that was not about the logistics of the plan. I told him I was fine, well settled, and that the room was good. I told him to go home and call James in the morning. He left. I went back to my book. The thing about living at Cloverfield from the inside was that it was a different kind of knowledge from approving it from the outside. I had made a good facility. I believed that before I moved in, and I confirmed it in the days that followed. The food was what I had wanted it to be, a dining room that functioned as a real dining room, the meals produced with the care of a kitchen that understood the difference between feeding people and feeding them well. The common spaces had the unhurried quality I had worked to protect through every renovation, the sense that the space belonged to whoever was using it rather than to a schedule running behind it. What I had not understood, sitting in Patty's rehabilitation facility 20 years ago, and reading the space with a teacher's trained attention, was what it felt like from the inside of that belonging. The particular rest of being somewhere where someone else manages the problem of the next thing. The heat running correctly without your attention, the meals arriving, the maintenance handled. I had managed all of those things myself for 19 years on Birchwood, not with difficulty. I was capable and I had the service providers and the systems, but there is a thing that managing your own logistics takes from a person day by day that only becomes apparent when it is no longer being taken. I noticed it the third morning, sitting at the east window with my coffee before anyone else was moving in the corridor. The quiet that was not mine to maintain. I just sat in it. At breakfast I sat with a woman named Genevieve, who had come to Cloverfield 2 months prior from a house she had lived in for 40 years, and we talked about the October light and her daughter who called every evening and her late husband who had been an electrician and mine who had been an engineer. She asked if I was new. I said fairly recently arrived. She said it took about 3 weeks before it started to feel ordinary, and that ordinary was better than it sounded. I told her I thought that was right. She told me the pastries on Thursday mornings were worth planning the week around, that the kitchen had a pastry cook who understood what a proper Thursday required. She said whoever built this place had built it for the people in it, which was not something you could say about every facility she'd looked at. I said I was glad it was working. Sandra came by my room on Wednesday afternoon with 2 cups of coffee, and the door open in the easy way of a professional conversation rather than a social one. We went over 3 things: the East Garden's winter preparation, a staffing question in the memory care wing she wanted my read on, and the kitchen budget review for the quarter. 20 minutes, the same way we had handled quarterly calls for 17 years. Efficiently and without ceremony. When we were done, she looked at me with the question she had not asked directly. She said, "Are you all right being here?" I told her it was good, both in the specific sense and the larger one. She said, "You walk through this place like it fits." I thought about Chester, who had said once that the only thing worth building was something you understood from the inside rather than just from the outside. Something you had genuinely needed before you made it. I told her I had been more right about what I was making than I had understood at the time. She nodded and picked up her notes and went back to her 3 simultaneous things because Sandra was always managing 3 simultaneous things, and that was also exactly right. Patty came Saturday for a second visit, bringing a potted rosemary, practical in the way Patty's gestures were always practical under the soft surface. She set it on my windowsill and looked at the casements again the way she had on the first visit, taking them in more carefully this time. She said, "These windows are larger than the others in the corridor." I said they were good windows. She said, with the quietness of a person arriving at something slowly, "Did you know about this room before you moved in?" I told her I had some familiarity with the facility. She looked at the rosemary on the sill. Then she said, "Mom, I have the feeling there is something very large I don't know." I told her she was right, and that the shape of it would become clear soon, and that she was going to be all right when it did. She said okay. That was Patty. The honest question, the real answer, and then she let it settle. She had done that since she was 10 years old. Carol and Dennis had been to Birchwood the prior week. I knew this because Carol called to ask where I kept the utility contacts, framing it as a courtesy, making sure everything was in order. It was not a courtesy. She was assembling the maintenance file for a property she was preparing to transfer. I gave her the numbers because the house needed its maintenance regardless of what she intended, and I said nothing beyond that. She thanked me and said the facility looked lovely on the website, that whoever designed it had really given it thought. I said yes. Someone had. Roy came the following morning with the East Corridor hot water pressure resolved, and an update on the scheduled maintenance for the month. He went through it with his usual thoroughness, and when he finished he asked if there was anything else on the facility side he should be aware of. I said the East Garden beds would need attention before the hard frost. He said he would have someone on it by the end of the week. I thanked him and he left. Patty called that evening, which meant Dennis had called her, which was how information moved in this family, outward from Dennis in concentric rings, each ring receiving a slightly more processed version of the original than the last. She said, "Mom, Dennis is upset." I said I knew. She said, "He says the house is in a trust." I said it was. She said, "Did you know we were going to try to sell it?" I said I had a reasonable idea. Her silence after that had texture, the gathering quality I had learned to recognize. Patty feeling her way toward something through what she could sense rather than what she knew. She said, "Are you angry with us?" I thought about that question for a moment because it was the real question, the one underneath the logistical one, and Patty asked the real question in a way nobody else in my family did. Without positioning, without defense. Just open. I told her no. I told her I had been going my own way long enough that what they had assumed did not cost me anything real. I said that the vote had told me something true, the same way most things do if you let them, which was that I had arranged my affairs correctly and at exactly the right time. She said, "You planned all of this." I said I had been planning it for 20 years. A silence. Then, "Why didn't you tell us?" I thought about how to answer that honestly without using it as a venue for grievances I had no particular interest in airing. I said that for 20 years none of them had asked about my financial arrangements and I had not offered them, and that had been a reasonable way to live as separate adults. I said what they had done with the vote had made that arrangement no longer workable, and that the conversation they should have with James Hobart would explain what came next. She said, "Is it bad?" I said no. I said it was clarifying. She was quiet again. Then she said, in her truest register, the one that came through when the social machinery dropped away, "I drove past the house tonight. On the way home from work. I still checked the lights. That was the thing that reached me. Not the vote, not the brochure, not Carol's coat, not the careful arrangement of two incidents into a pattern. My daughter driving past the dark house out of 20 years of habit, checking for a light that was no longer going to be there. I told her the house was fine. I told her there were lights on a timer. I told her she did not need to drive past anymore. She said okay. She said she was glad I was somewhere good. I said I was somewhere I designed. That is about as good as it gets. I don't think she understood what I meant. That was all right. She would soon enough. Kevin arrived on a Friday afternoon, exactly when he had said he would, because Kevin kept his schedule. He came directly to Cloverfield without stopping at Birchwood first, which I noticed. He came to see me, not the house. He sat in Chester's reading chair and looked at the room with the easy way he had of being in spaces, not measuring them, just accepting them. He said the east light was good. I said it was what the room was for. He looked at the casements for a long moment. Kevin had been an architect for 22 years. He worked with buildings the way other people work with language, reading the decisions embedded in the structure, the choices made at specification and what they meant about how the space was intended to be used. He looked at a room and understood the argument it was making. A standard residential room in a care facility made one argument. A room with custom-specified casements, enlarged during a documented renovation, 8 inches taller and 12 inches wider than every other window in the building, made a different argument. It was the argument of someone who had stood in that room, looked at the east wall, and decided the light mattered. He said, "How much of this place did you design?" I told him most of the significant decisions. He let that sit for a moment. Then he said, in the thoughtful way Kevin said things that cost him something to say clearly, "You always planned to come here." I said I had always planned to come here on my own terms. He was quiet for a while. The receiving kind of quiet, not the processing kind. The quiet that comes when something you suspected turns out to be true at a larger scale than you imagined it. He said, "When did you decide? The room, I mean. When did you know it was going to be this one?" I told him I had thought about it during the renovation 8 years ago, that I had stood in this room with the contractor and looked at the east wall and understood it was where I would eventually be, that it had seemed a reasonable thing to plan for, and planning for it had not seemed sad. He said that was the most you thing he had ever heard. I asked him what he meant. He said, "You made a plan for your own future that included a care facility, and your response to it was to make the care facility right." I told him that seemed like the practical approach. He shook his head slightly. Not disagreement. The motion of a person absorbing something completely. Then, "Dennis went to see James Hobart this morning." I said I know. He said, "James didn't tell him anything." I said James wouldn't tell him anything without my direction. That was what having an attorney meant. Kevin said, "Dennis is going to push harder." I said Dennis could push. James would schedule a meeting when I told him to, and at that meeting Dennis and Carol would understand the full shape of things. Kevin said, "Carol is already working with someone else. An agent from the city." I told him I knew. He looked at me. "Mom," he said, "they are not going to stop on the house until someone tells them directly." I said that was true, and that someone was going to tell them directly at a time and place of my choosing with documentation and the right witnesses. I said the sequence mattered. Chester had understood that about how things worked. A right thing done in the wrong order is still wrong. 20 years of correct sequencing was not the place to rush the last step. Kevin was quiet. "Then what happens to me and Patty?" He asked it as a question and I looked at him, my youngest child, who had read a caption on a wall and kept it for 3 weeks, who had said Dad would have loved this, who was asking now about what happened to him and his sister rather than about what happened to the house. I told him that was what James Hobart's meeting was going to cover, and that he and Patty would be in that meeting, and that he should come with no assumptions. He nodded. He said he could do that. He stayed for dinner in the dining room. We ate easily. in the particular comfort of two people who share a secret and are waiting together for the same moment to arrive. The dining room was warm and the conversation was ordinary, and I felt no urgency in it at all, which was its own kind of telling, after months of the family moving toward this, all of us on our different trajectories toward the same Friday morning. After dinner he walked me back to my room and stood in the doorway for a moment. He said, "The staff here, they treat you differently." I said Sandra had asked them to give me a particular quality of attention. He said, "No, that's not it. It's not attentiveness. It's the way people behave toward someone they have a working relationship with, someone they take direction from." He was an architect. He had spent his career reading the built and unbuilt evidence of how people organize themselves in relation to each other, what the spaces said about the power in the room, what the behavior said about who held the authority. He had read this room correctly. I said, "Kevin." He said, "Yeah." I said, "Go home. Get some sleep. I will call you when I have told James to schedule the meeting." He said, "Okay." He hugged me in the doorway, a proper one, not ceremonial. He smelled like the road, the same as he'd smelled the morning of the vote when he came in with gas station coffee and said the azaleas looked good and was the only one whose laugh had been real. I watched him walk back down the south corridor and past the history display at the east intersection without stopping. He already knew what it said. He had known for 3 weeks and he had kept it as carefully as I had. That was the thing about Kevin. He had always paid more attention than anyone assumed. He had just never done it loudly. Dennis was the one who announced. Kevin was the one who watched. Chester had been that kind of man. I had loved two of them of the same quality for different lengths of time, and understood that the quality itself was not something you could teach. It was something a person either brought or didn't, and Kevin had brought it since he was old enough to sit in a room and be still without being asked. I stayed in the doorway for a moment after Kevin had gone, looking down the south corridor at the east wing intersection where the history display was mounted on the wall, the small frame thing with the black and white photograph and the caption in serif type that my youngest child had read 3 weeks ago and kept as a private thing rather than a weapon. The corridor was quiet in the way of a well-built building in the evening, the sounds at the right distance, the resident rooms closed, the common spaces settling into their evening arrangement. I had designed this building to be quiet in its corridors at night. I had specified the wall insulation thickness with that in mind, the kind of specification that is easy to overlook in a budget conversation and that makes all the difference to the person in the room. Good buildings keep the noise where it belongs and the quiet where it belongs, and the people inside them know the difference, even if they can't name it. I called James Hobart Saturday morning. I told him the family was ready. I told him Dennis had been to the office and he had been correctly non-committal. I told him Carol was pursuing the house with a second agent. I told him Patty was asking the right questions without knowing they were the right questions. I told him Kevin was keeping his word. James said, "When do you want the meeting?" I said next Friday. I said I wanted Dennis, Carol, Patty, and Kevin all present. I said to send a formal letter to each of them individually on firm letterhead, with language that made clear this was not optional. The "please attend at your earliest convenience" language that told people this was a scheduled conversation about something with legal weight. He said the letters would go out Monday. I thanked him. He said, "You have been very patient, Lenora." I told him I had had very good material to work with. He laughed. He had a good laugh, James, the laugh of a man who had spent a career watching human nature arrive at its full expression in small rooms, and had developed a genuine appreciation for the moments when it arrived somewhere better than expected. I set the phone down and picked up the photograph from the nightstand. Chester from the first summer, squinting into the sun with the half-embarrassed smile he made when someone pointed a camera at him. His hand raised slightly as if he was about to say something. He had been very good about fair outcomes, patient enough to build toward them correctly rather than just hoping they arrived. I had learned that from watching him at the kitchen table with Dennis, 17 years old and full of grievance, running out of momentum. The patience not as the opposite of strength but as its most controlled expression. 6 more days. I set the photograph back and picked up my book. The letters arrived Tuesday. James's firm sent letters when it said it would send letters, which was one of the things I had valued about James for 20 years, that he was a person on whom the sequence of events could be depended upon, the same quality Chester had had, the same quality I had tried to build into everything I made. Each letter was addressed individually, on the firm's heavy cream stationery, The kind that communicates immediately that the thing inside is a professional communication rather than personal correspondence. The language was formal and specific. Please attend a meeting scheduled for Friday the 28th at 9 in the morning at the offices of Hobart and Cross, attorneys at law, regarding the disposition of assets held in the Wynn Heritage Trust and related matters of record. Please be advised that your attendance is requested at the direction of the trustee. At the direction of the trustee. James's language was always exact. That phrase had two meanings in the same sentence, and whether you understood one or both of them depended on what you knew. And on Friday morning they were going to know everything. Dennis called Tuesday evening. His letter had arrived that day. He said, "I got a letter from James Hobart." I said, "I know." He said, "It says there's a meeting Friday morning about the disposition of assets held by the Wynn Heritage Trust." He was reading directly from the letter, the particular care of a person reading something they are not sure they understand. He said it the way he said things that surprised him, which was a kind of careful flatness, the voice of a man reading from a script he had not prepared. I said yes. He said, "What assets?" I said James would cover everything at the meeting, and that I would see Dennis Friday morning at 9. He said, "Carol is coming." I said I expected so. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Mom." He said it the way he said my name when he was trying to reach me through the formal presentation of himself and wasn't quite sure how. "Mom, what is this about?" I thought about Chester at the kitchen table with a 17-year-old Dennis, waiting, not rushing the arrival of whatever was going to come. Patience not as the absence of urgency, but as the clearest expression of confidence in the outcome. I said, "Dennis, come Friday. Bring Carol. Listen to James. Everything will be clear." He was quiet for a long moment. Then all right. He hung up. Patty called an hour later. Her letter had also arrived. She said less than Dennis had, asked fewer questions. She said, "Mom, should I be worried?" I told her no. I told her she should come Friday and sit down and listen, and that what she heard was going to explain a great many things. She said okay. She said she would bring Kevin. Kevin texted, "Got the letter. See you Friday." Then after a moment, "Are you ready?" I texted back, 20 years. He sent back the same laugh he had given me on the phone 3 weeks earlier, the one that came from somewhere genuine. I stayed with the phone in my hands for a moment in the quiet room, my lamp casting its warm tone. The rosemary Patty had brought on the windowsill, green and sharp and growing. The photograph on the nightstand. Chester squinting into the first summer sun. 4 days. Then 3. Then 2. The week moved with the steadiness of the last movement of a thing in progress, each day its own right step, done with the same quality of attention you gave every other step because the last steps are the ones that hold the whole structure together. I turned a page. Sandra stopped by Thursday afternoon, not in her director capacity but as herself, with 2 cups of coffee and the door open to whatever conversation needed to happen. She sat in the second chair and held her cup and said, "Tomorrow." I said, "Tomorrow." She said, "Is there anything you need from me?" I told her I did not think so, that James had the documents and I had the room, that the sequence was correct and the preparation had been 20 years in the making, and nothing was going to be unclear. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've thought about this for years. What it would look like when it came." I asked her what she had imagined. She said she had imagined something dramatic. A confrontation or a scene, the kind of revelation that arrived loudly. She said what you've actually built is the opposite. It's just a room with papers in it and people who don't know yet what they're looking at. I said that was always the most useful kind of room. The ones that looked like nothing until the papers opened. She said, "Is that Chester?" I looked at the photograph on the nightstand, the one from the first summer. Chester squinting into the sun. I said yes. She said she had heard me mention him enough over 17 years to feel she knew him a little. I told her that was probably accurate. Chester had been the kind of person who was present in a room even after he was no longer in it, who had the quality of leaving impressions that lasted. I told her he had taught me most of what I understood about building things that held up. Not the specific knowledge, not the engineering, but the patience underneath it, the willingness to do the next right step without needing to see the whole staircase yet. Sandra said, "I think he would have liked the east window." I told her I thought so too. That was one of the reasons I had chosen this room. She stayed another 20 minutes, talking through nothing of consequence, The easy conversation of two people who have known each other long enough to sit in a space without agenda. Then she gathered her things and stood up and looked at me in the doorway. She said, "I'm proud of what we built out here." I told her she had built most of it, which was true. I had funded it and decided it and approved it. Sandra Lim had made it what it was every day for 17 years through the 1,000 small choices that are the actual substance of a well-run operation. She said we built it. I said yes. We did. She left and I sat in the room with Chester's photograph and the rosemary Patty had brought and the east window light going the color of last things. The azaleas in the east garden had been attended to, Roy's people having gotten to them before the hard frost. From my window they were bare canes, mulched and patient, all the work happening underground where nobody was watching them. That was how perennials worked. The visible part went away for the winter and what kept them alive was the root, the unseen preparation, the stored work of many previous seasons. They would come back in the spring, more than they had been the year before, the way perennials do when the root system has had time to establish itself completely. Friday morning arrived cold and clear. I dressed in the clothes I had chosen for it, the gray wool I wore when something required substance rather than ceremony. I put Chester's reading chair at the edge of the room before I left, the way I always positioned it when I was going to be out for the morning, angled toward the east window so the light would fall on it in the afternoon when I came back. I sat in the facility van while Roy drove me to the county seat, 7 miles on county roads I had driven for 20 years in my own car. The same roads I had taken to James Hobart's office for 20 years of quarterly calls and annual reviews and the specific meetings that had built, piece by piece, everything that was about to become visible. Roy drove with the quiet professional care he brought to all his work and said nothing, because Roy was good at knowing when silence was the appropriate thing. Outside the window the late October county was bare and clear, the last leaves down, the fields harvested, the architecture of things showing through now that the covering was gone. I had always liked this part of the season. The true shape of things, the branch structure and the building lines and the slope of ground that the summer concealed, all of it returned to view for the months before the snow. We arrived on time. Roy held the van door and said, "Good luck, Mrs. Wynn." I told him I would not need luck. I had James Hobart and 20 years of correctly filed documents, which was better than luck by a considerable margin. Roy smiled. He said he would be back at 11. I thanked him and walked to the door. James met me in the lobby and walked me to the conference room himself. It was a good room, the kind that told you exactly what it was without announcing it, wood and order and the particular light that comes through north-facing windows in a county seat building. The light that does not change with the weather and does not flatter and does not distort, just illuminates everything with the clear neutrality of a room built to tell the truth. There were 5 chairs around the table and 5 place settings, water and a folder at each position. James had prepared the folders in the order that would allow the information to arrive correctly, each document behind the next in the sequence he and I had discussed across several weeks of careful preparation. He was a good attorney, James. He had been a good attorney for 20 years. He was going to be exactly what this morning required. He showed me to my chair, the one at the head of the table, and asked if I needed anything before they arrived. I told him I was fine. He straightened his own folder and looked at me with the expression of a man who had been building toward a morning for 2 decades and had arrived at it with everything in order. He said, "You know this is going to change things." I told him that was the point of it. He said, "How do you want to feel afterward?" I thought about that question for a moment. It was not the kind of question attorneys usually asked and James knew that, but he had never been an attorney in the way that courts required attorneys to be and nothing more. He had been, for 20 years, a person I trusted with the full shape of what I was doing and why. I told him I wanted to feel what I already felt, which was that the work had been done correctly and the sequence had been followed and the people I loved were about to understand something that was going to cost them something, and that the cost was the right cost for what they had done, and that I was prepared to sit in a room with them while they paid it. He nodded. He said, "Then let's begin." He took his place at the side of the table. I looked at the 5 chairs, 4 of them still empty, and I looked at the folders James had placed and I thought about Chester with the wrench in his hand in September 20 years ago, the door open to the good weather, the sequence of things that had come from that loss and what I had made of it. Chester would not have done what I had done with the money and the trust and the 20 years of patient building. He would have found a different way. He had always found a different way, his own specific way, and it had been the right one for him. But he would have understood what I had done, and what I was about to let happen in this room. He would have sat in my chair and put his hands in his lap and waited for the door. I heard the elevator down the hall. I put my hands in my lap and waited for the door. They arrived together, all four of them, which meant they had come in a group from Dennis and Carol's house, which meant they had been in the same room before this and had arrived with a shared position and a shared expectation. That was fine. Shared expectations were useful until the information changed them. The information was about to change everything. Dennis looked at me and then at the folders on the table and then at James standing at the corner of the room. He said, "What is all this?" James said, "Please sit down." They sat. Carol across from me, Dennis to her left, Patty beside Dennis with her hands folded, Kevin at the far end of the table, one chair's distance from the others, in the seat where he had placed himself, apart from the shared position, close to the window. James stood at the front of the room with the composed authority of a man who had been preparing for this specific meeting for 20 years, and was not going to rush any part of it. He said, "Thank you all for coming. My name is James Hobart. I have been Lenora Wynn's attorney for 20 years, and the principal trustee of the Wynn Heritage Trust for the same period. I've asked you here today on behalf of Mrs. Wynn to discuss the current structure of her assets, which I understand has been the subject of some confusion in recent weeks." Carol said. "There's been confusion because nobody told us anything." James looked at her with the mild patience of a man who had heard that particular sentiment many times, in many forms, across many conference tables, and had never once been hurried by it. He said, "That's one of the things we're going to address this morning. If you'll allow me to proceed in order, I'll answer every question you have before we're done." He opened his folder. He looked once at me. I nodded. He said, "Let's begin." James opened the first folder with the deliberateness of someone who understands that the first page of a document sets the tone for everything that follows, and who has chosen the first page accordingly. He said he was going to present the contents of the Wynn Heritage Trust in an order that would allow each item to be understood before the next was introduced, and that he would take questions at the end of each section. He said this with the same calm he had brought to every meeting I had seen him conduct. Not cold, not impatient, just clear. The calm of a man who has done this kind of work for 30 years and understands that the clarity itself is its own form of respect. He began with the real property. He placed a certified copy of the deed to 412 Birchwood Lane on the table in front of Dennis. Dennis picked it up and read it. Carol read over his shoulder. The deed was explicit. Property held in trust, Lenora Margaret Wynn, trustee. Transfer date 12 years prior. County stamp in the upper right corner. James said that as a revocable living trust, the property was the trustee's to manage, retain, or dispose of entirely at the trustee's discretion, and that no transfer or sale could occur without the trustee's written consent. He said this without flourish as one of the basic facts, the way you state a mathematical operation before showing the result. Dennis set the deed down. He looked at me. He said, "You've had this for 12 years. I said yes. Carol said, "And you never told us." I said it had not come up. She started to respond and James held up one hand, not a silencing gesture, a procedural one, the kind that says there is more to come and it is worth hearing before responding. He said, "This is the first document. Please allow me to continue." He placed the second set of documents on the table. He said the Wynn Heritage Trust held as its primary asset a 78% majority ownership interest in Cloverfield Senior Living LLC, a licensed senior residential care facility at the address they were all familiar with. He said the ownership had been established at the time of the facility's founding 17 years prior, and had been held continuously in the trust since that date. He said the trust was the majority owner of record, and had been involved in all material decisions related to the facility's operation across the full period of its existence. He placed a summary page at each of their 5 places. The summary page had 2 columns. One column listed the assets held by the Wynn Heritage Trust, beginning with the real property on Birchwood Lane, and moving to the ownership interest in Cloverfield Senior Living LLC, and the associated holdings. The second column listed the appraised values, each audited, each current, each set down in the particular plain language of a professional document that has nothing to prove and no interest in drama. I watched them read the numbers at the bottom of the page. The numbers that represented 17 years of a decision made carefully and managed well, which is to say they were numbers considerably larger than anyone in that room had assumed Lenora Wynn possessed. Not a fortune in the way that word gets used carelessly, but a fortune in the way it is actually meant, which is enough that the person who holds it is not beholden to anyone's plan for her life. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when information has arrived that is too large for the immediate response and everyone is processing at the same speed and arriving at the same wordlessness. Carol said, "That's not possible." James said it was audited and documented and he could provide the supporting materials on request. Carol said, "She's a retired schoolteacher." James said she was also the founding trustee of the Wynn Heritage Trust and the majority owner of Cloverfield Senior Living, and had been both of those things for 17 years, and that these facts did not conflict with each other. Patty said, very quietly and not to anyone in particular, "She chose this room." She said it in the tone of someone arriving at something that was already obvious once you said it out loud. She was looking at the casements in the conference room window, a different window entirely, but the thought had come from the same direction. Carol put the summary page down on the table with a specific quality of care, the care of someone managing a response they have not yet chosen. Dennis said, in a voice considerably quieter than his ordinary register, "Mom." I looked at him. He said, "How long have you known about the facility?" "From the beginning." "When did this start?" I told him it had started with Patty's broken ankle 20 years ago. I told him about sitting in the rehabilitation facility twice a week and reading the room the way a teacher reads a room. I told him about the bank notice on a county fence on a gray afternoon, about James Hobart's name on the notice, about the drive out in November with the leaves down in the field and the red oak at the southwest corner, and the decision made in that field without rushing. I told him about Sandra Lem, about the renovation and the tile sample book and the 4 paint options and the right one and the pale yellow azaleas on the entrance walk because Chester had liked yellow. Dennis listened to all of it without interrupting. This was not something Dennis did easily. He was a man who processed information at speed and moved toward conclusions and brought the people around him with him. Sitting still while information arrived in its own order was a discipline he had not developed, and he was exercising it in that conference room with visible effort, and I noticed and was grateful for it. When I finished, he said, "The flower beds on the brochure." I said yes. He said, "Carol brought that brochure." I said I know. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something I had not specifically prepared for, not because I had not thought about every possible thing he might say, I had been thinking about it for 20 years, but because of the direction it came from. He said, "Why didn't you tell us? Not about the trust. About any of it. About what you were building out there." It was not an accusation exactly. It was partly an accusation, but it was mostly a real question, the kind that comes from confusion rather than grievance, the kind that has a hurt underneath it that is genuine. He was asking why his mother had lived a substantial second life for 2 decades and had not told her children, and the question had weight. I told him that for 20 years none of them had asked about my life beyond the life they already knew. I told him I had mentioned the investments and none of them had followed up. I told him I had mentioned the trust in the context of estate planning, and none of them had asked for more than the basic fact of it. I said, "Dennis, you called me once a week for 19 years. In most of those calls you told me about your life. You asked about mine the way you ask a question when you already know the answer." He started to say something. He stopped. I said, "That's not a criticism. It's just how we were. And it's why this is a surprise." Patty made a sound that was not a word. A specific intake of breath, the sound of someone trying to contain a response larger than the room they are in. She put her hand over her mouth. I said her name. She shook her head. She was crying, but not from grief. From the particular kind of recognition that comes when you understand you have been wrong about the scale of something, and the wrongness is not painful but enormous. She said, "You designed this place." I said yes. She said, "The window in my room." "Your room." I said yes. She said, "The pastries on Thursday." I said I had not specified the pastries. The kitchen had done that on their own initiative, which was what happened in a well-run operation when you hired the right people and gave them room. She laughed and cried at the same time, in the specific combination that had belonged to Patty since she was 7 years old and still belonged to her. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked at the table and said, "I drove past the house for 20 years. On my way home from work. Just to check the lights." I said I know. She said, "You had a whole life we didn't see." I said they had seen parts of it. This was another part. Carol had been quiet for several minutes. This was not Carol's ordinary mode. In professional context, Carol moved forward, filling space, operating from a position already taken. But something in the room's arrangement of certainties had shifted in a way she was still reconfiguring around. She said, "You moved into a facility you own." I said, "I moved into a facility I built for this purpose, among others." She said, "You let us choose it." I said, "You chose well." She looked at me for a long moment. The good coat was folded across her lap, the dove gray wool she had worn to the Thursday meeting in my living room, to the Cloverfield tour, and to this conference room this morning. She had worn it to everything she had decided about in advance. But she had not decided about this. Nobody had decided about this except me 20 years ago, in a November field with a patient attorney. She said, "What happens to the house?" James said that decision belonged entirely to the trustee. Carol looked at me. I said, "The house stays in the trust until I'm ready to decide. Not before." She took that in. She said, "And the facility?" I said the facility was well managed and would continue to be well managed under Sandra Lim, as it had been for 17 years. I said nothing about what the facility was worth in terms of her planning, and nothing about what would happen to it in time, because those were decisions for another time and another conversation, and that conversation had not been earned yet in this room on this morning. Carol was quiet after that. I want to be accurate about what that silence looked like because Carol's silences were not all the same. There was a silence she used to gather herself before a rebuttal. There was a silence she used when she was recalculating a position. And there was this silence, which I had not seen from Carol in 30 years of being her mother-in-law, which was the silence of a person confronting a situation they had not modeled for. She had modeled the Thursday meeting in my living room. She had modeled the tour. She had modeled the real estate conversations. She had not modeled this room, these documents, this particular morning where every calculation she had been making was suddenly being run on a set of numbers she had not known about. The facility she had identified as the finest option in the county was the finest option in the county because I had built it to be. The flower beds on the brochure she had carried in her bag were my specific selection from the second page of a catalog Sandra had sent me 3 springs ago. The room she had seen on the tour, with the custom casements and the east morning light, was the room I had designed 8 years prior for the person I intended to be when I arrived there. She said very carefully, "It's a very good facility, Lenora." That was all. Not an apology. Not an admission of anything. Just the statement, level and direct, and under it the acknowledgement of everything the statement implied. She had looked at Cloverfield with the eye she brought to every room she assessed, and she had found it genuinely excellent, and she was choosing to say so plainly rather than say nothing. I said, "Thank you." Kevin had not said anything since they sat down. He was at the far end of the table with his water glass and his unopened folder. Now he looked at me. He said, "Is there anything you want from us?" Specifically. It was the right question. Kevin always asked the right question when he finally asked one. I said what I wanted was for all of them to understand the full picture of my life and my affairs, which was what James had just given them. I said what I wanted was for Carol to stop reaching out to real estate agents about the Birchwood property, which was not available. I said what I wanted was for all of them to understand that I was at Cloverfield because I chose to be there, that I was in good health, that the vote had not harmed me, that what it had done was clarify the timing of this conversation by several months. Dennis said, "The vote?" I said yes. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "We were trying to take care of you." I said, "I know." He said, "We thought the house was just a house. We thought the barn was empty." I looked at him. He caught himself. He said, "I mean, we didn't know what you had. What was in there?" I said that was a very accurate description of the situation. He looked at me and I looked at him across the table, and for a moment he was 11 years old and at the kitchen table, and Chester was beside me in the doorway watching, and Dennis was running out of the momentum of a grievance and discovering that what was underneath the grievance was just the ordinary need to be seen clearly. He was still that person. Still turning, still working towards something, slower than he appeared, more honest than he usually let himself be. He said, "I'm sorry about the vote." Carol's chin came up slightly. He put his hand briefly on her arm and looked at me. He said it again. "I'm sorry about the vote, Mom. We should have asked first." I told him I accepted that. James resumed smoothly, the way a good conductor resumes after a moment that needed to happen. He said he had a few more items to put before them if they were ready. They were ready. The meeting ran another 40 minutes. James covered the trust's additional holdings, the full accounting of 20 years of careful and quiet work, set out in the order that made the most sense for understanding. He covered the succession provisions, which I had written with him 3 years prior, and which he described in general terms because the specifics were mine to share in my own time. He covered the management structure at Cloverfield, and what my advisory role would continue to be. He covered the house on Birchwood, the trust status, the maintenance situation, and the process by which the trust could eventually make decisions about it. Carol asked 2 questions, both practical, both about what this meant for the estate arrangement she and Dennis had assumed. The first was about whether there were any assets outside the trust that would be accessible as part of an estate settlement. The answer was no, or essentially no. The second was about what the trust succession provisions meant for the family. James said that Mrs. Wynn would share those details in her own time. She took both answers without disputing them, which was not acceptance exactly but was the closest thing to it that Carol produced in a situation not of her making. She sat straight and still and looked at the folder in front of her, and I watched her work something through behind her face, the particular internal process of a very organized person absorbing information that requires her to reorganize. Patty asked one question. She asked whether the fact that I owned Cloverfield meant I could make decisions about my own care. James said the trust structure separated ownership from residency, and that my care decisions were entirely my own to make, as they had always been. Patty nodded and looked at her hands and seemed to find this genuinely reassuring. Kevin asked nothing. He looked out the window for most of the final 40 minutes, and his face held the particular quality of a person who is listening and thinking, and has decided that silence is more useful than speaking. At 11 o'clock James said he believed they had covered the primary matters, and that he was available for individual consultations at anyone's request. He said it with the particular efficiency of a man who has conducted a meeting correctly, and is giving people the door. They stood. Carol was first. She walked to the door without speaking. Dennis followed and stopped and came back to where I was still seated. He stood for a moment, then put his hand briefly on my shoulder. A light touch, the kind you give something you cannot yet find the words for. Then he left. Patty hugged me long and proper and smelled of the rosemary she had repotted on my windowsill 2 weeks before, which was an unlikely thing to smell like in an attorney's conference room and which I was grateful for. I held it and let it be. Kevin was last. He did not hug me. He sat in the chair next to mine and stayed there for a moment, in the easy company of 2 people who have been waiting for the same thing to happen. He said 20 years. I said 20 years. He said, "Did it go the way you thought it would?" I told him it had gone better in some ways. I had not expected Dennis to apologize. I had not expected Carol to be quiet for as long as she had been. I had not expected Patty's laugh and cry arriving at the same moment. He said, "And me?" I said, "I expected exactly you." He smiled the Slowchester smile. He stood, picked up his jacket, and looked at me once more before he left. He said, "You know what I kept thinking about during the whole thing?" I said, "What?" He said, "The caption on the wall. Established through the Wynn Heritage Trust. 3 weeks I had that in my head and I didn't say a word." I said, "No, you didn't." He said, "I'm glad I didn't." I said, "So am I." He left and the conference room was quiet. He said, "And me?" I said, "I expected exactly you." He smiled the Slowchester smile. He stood, picked up his jacket and said he would call on Sunday. I said, "Good." He left, and the conference room was quiet with just James and me and the 5 folders and the water glasses and the clear north-facing light that tells the truth without flattering. James came back around the table and sat in the chair beside mine. Not the attorney's position, the chair of a person who has done something difficult alongside someone they have worked with for a long time and is sitting with them in the aftermath of it. He asked if I was all right. I told him I was very all right. He said, "Dennis surprised me." The apology. I said Dennis sometimes surprised me too. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "For what it's worth. 20 years ago when you walked into that field with me, I thought I was looking at a retired schoolteacher with a project. I revised that assessment fairly quickly, but I want to say it plainly. This is remarkable work, Lenora." I told him it was correct work. That was the part that mattered. You could do remarkable things incorrectly and they fell down when they were tested. Correct work held. He said. Correct and remarkable. I said I would accept both. He went to find coffee while I waited for Roy, and I sat in the chair at the head of the table in the quiet of a room where 20 years had just become visible, and I felt the specific texture of something completed. Not finished, completed. The way a building is completed when the final inspection is done and the keys are in hand and the people who are going to live in it walk through the door for the first time. The structure is done. The living is what comes after. Roy arrived at 11 and drove me back through the Bear County on roads I knew. He said the East Garden had gotten a second pass of mulch that morning because the frost forecast had moved up. I told him that was excellent foresight. We drove the rest of the way in the comfortable quiet of two people who had worked together long enough to know when quiet was the right thing. The county was bare and clear in the late November light, every tree showing its true shape now, the architecture of things visible now that the covering was gone. I had always liked this part of the year. The honest structure of it, the ground exactly as it was, the sky exactly as it was, nothing softened or concealed or promising anything it wasn't prepared to keep. 3 months of winter. Then the root system would do what root systems do, and the canes would put out their first green, and the pale yellow azaleas would come back in the East Garden, and it would be spring and everything would have been growing underground the whole time. Dennis came to Cloverfield on a Tuesday afternoon 2 weeks later, alone without Carol, which told me the visit was his idea rather than a shared one, and which told me something about where he was in his processing. He sat in the chair across from Chester's reading chair and looked at the room before he looked at anything in it specifically. He looked at the casements, the paint, the tile visible in the doorway to the small bathroom, the framed county historical photograph on the wall by the door. He had walked through this building twice before, and he was looking at it now with the information he had been given 2 weeks prior, which was that every choice in this room had been made by his mother. He said, the third of 4 paint options. I said, the third. Yes. He said, why the third? I said, because when you set the 4 samples next to each other, the first 2 were almost right and the fourth was too green and the third was correct. He was quiet for a moment. Then that's exactly how you pick things. I remember watching you pick wallpaper for the upstairs hallway when I was 12. You took about 30 seconds. I told him I had looked at enough choices to know when the right one arrived. He nodded. He looked at the photograph on the nightstand. He said, is that the first summer? I said yes. He looked at it for a long time. He said, I keep thinking about the letter. Not James Hobart's letter. The one in my mind that you never sent. Explaining all of this. I asked him what was in the letter. He said he wasn't sure. Maybe just that she was all right. That she had something she was working on. That he didn't need to worry the way he worried. He said maybe if he had known she was building something real, something that was hers, he would have worried differently. I said he had worried with the information he had. He had known his mother was a 74-year-old widow alone in a Victorian house and that there had been 2 incidents, and he had arrived at the conclusion the available information supported. The problem was not the conclusion. The problem was the missing information. He said, and you didn't give it to us. I said no. He said, why not? I sat with that question for a moment. He had asked it in the conference room from a position of grievance. Now he was asking from genuine trying to understand which deserved a genuine answer. I said, Chester and I bought the house on Birchwood when we were 28 and never told anyone what we paid for it. We didn't discuss our salaries with the family. We didn't tell people what we had or what we were building toward. Not from secrecy. Because we believed some things belonged to us and that keeping them ours was part of how we held them safely. He thought about that. I said, the trust was mine. The facility was mine. The work was mine. I built it in my own time with my own decisions and my own errors, and it worked the way I hoped it would. And it was better for being private than it would have been if I had had to explain it at every stage to people who would have worried about it. He said, we would have worried. I said, yes. You would have. And I would have spent 20 years managing your worry instead of building the thing. He sat with that for a long while. Outside the east window the March air was moving through the bare canes of the garden, and the light was the particular flat light of a Tuesday in early spring that doesn't promise anything yet. Then he said, that's fair. 2 words. Short and real, and they cost him something. Dennis had been certain and forward-moving for 52 years, arriving at conclusions before most people had finished forming their questions. These 2 words, "in this direction about this situation," were the most honest I had heard from him in a very long time, maybe ever. I said, "Yes, it is." He said, after a pause, "Carol made some calls to apologize to the agents." I said I appreciated that. He said, "She processes differently than I do. It takes her longer to get from the analysis to the feeling." I said that was probably accurate. He said, "She called the place excellent. I heard her tell her sister on the phone that it was excellent, which is Carol's highest word." I said I was glad she had found it so. He stood up to leave and stopped in the doorway and looked at the casements one more time. He said, "You did a good job with the windows." I told him I had had very good material to work with. He almost smiled. "Close enough." Patty came back on a Saturday with a larger pot for the rosemary, which had outgrown the first one. She repotted it herself right there on the windowsill the way Patty did practical things all the way through and correctly. She got soil on the sill and cleaned it up. She set the newly potted rosemary back in the east light. She stood back and looked at it. She said it was doing that thing where the roots come out the bottom. I said yes. Rosemary does that when you give it enough of what it needs. She sat in the second chair and looked at her hands for a moment. The way she looked at things, she was deciding whether to say out loud. She said, "I looked you up online." I asked what she found. She said she had found the Cloverfield website and the county records and the reviews, and that the reviews all said the same thing in different words, which was that the facility felt like home rather than an institution, that whoever had built it had understood what they were building. She said she had read perhaps 30 reviews over 3 consecutive evenings, and then had put the phone down and sat with it for a while. I said I was glad the reviews were accurate. She said, "I used to tell people my mother was a retired schoolteacher." I said it the way you say something that is the whole answer. I told her it was the whole answer for most things, just not all of them. She nodded. She looked at the rosemary for a moment. Then she said, "I used to think you were lonely." I told her I had been lonely for a while after Chester. And then I had been busy, which was different from not being lonely but was its own good thing. The kind of good that does not ask anything from you but time and attention. She said, "Were you happy?" I thought about that question. The right answer was more than yes or no, but the right answer for Patty, who asked it with the fullness of someone who genuinely wanted to know, was something real and specific. I told her yes. Not all of it. Not the years when Chester was gone and the house was too large and the children were their own lives and the evenings were very long. But the 30 years at Hartfield, the 30 years of 5th graders who grew up and brought their own children by. The November mornings driving out with James Hobart to stand in a field and decide. The renovation, the tile, the 4 paint options and the right one. Sandra on a Friday with the quarterly reports. Roy with the maintenance schedule. Genevieve and the Thursday pastries. The east window in the morning with the light exactly as I had calculated it would be. I said yes. I was happy. Patty looked at the rosemary in the east light, rooted now in its larger pot, with more room to grow. She said, "Good. I'm glad you were." Then she looked at me and said, "I'm also glad you're still here to tell me that." I told her so was I. She stayed for the pastries the following Thursday, which was a new thing, and which Genevieve received as an entirely reasonable development, introducing herself to Patty with the authority of someone who had been at the table long enough to know who belonged at it. Kevin came on a Thursday morning without telling me, which was Kevin, and he had coffee in the dining room and tried the pastries and found them satisfactory. He texted me from the parking lot. Drive was worth it. I texted back that I had not specified the pastries. He sent back, "Of course you didn't." Then, "I told you Dad would have loved this." Then nothing more. That was Kevin. Exactly the right amount and then the silence. I went back to Birchwood in February. Alone on a clear cold morning, with the key that had always been mine. The house was the cold of an occupied space being maintained rather than lived in. A specific temperature that was not neglect but was absence. The cold that settles when the warmth of a person's daily presence is no longer there to meet it. I went to the kitchen first. The October light was not there. It was February, the angle was entirely wrong, and the maple had its bare winter structure rather than the leaves that let the light through in those 3 specific weeks. But the window was there, Chester's window, the one he had replaced in the second year because I had mentioned the drafts twice and the third time he had simply gotten up and measured it without being asked. The drawer for the pots was to my left, installed where he had put it after I told him 3 times that the cabinet arrangement made no sense, and he had agreed without argument and gotten the right hardware and done it correctly, and it had run smooth for 20 years. I put my hand on the drawer and pulled it open. The pots were inside, nested in the order I had arranged them the morning I moved out. I stood in the kitchen for a while in the February light, not doing anything in particular, just being in the room where I had made 40 years of ordinary decisions, where the decisions of one day and the next had accumulated into a life, the specific weight and texture of it, which you only feel fully when you are standing in the middle of it rather than looking at it from the outside. Then I went to the garage. The wrench was on the bench where it had been for 19 years and 11 months. I stood in front of it in the cold and I looked at it and thought about what the not moving had been. It had not been grief exactly, not after the first years. It had been a kind of keeping, the way you hold on to the last position of a thing because it still carries the impression of the person who held it there. Chester had been looking for that wrench. He had found it. He was holding it when I found him. The garage door was standing open to the September weather, and he had found what he was looking for, and that was the last of it. I had not moved it. And now I was ready to. Picked it up. It was heavier than I had expected, or I had forgotten the weight of it across 19 years of not picking it up. A good wrench, specific, well-made, the right tool for the task he had in mind. I turned it over once in my hands. Then I put it in the pocket of my coat and walked back through the house and turned the lights off as I went and locked the door from outside and got in the car. The wrench lives on the shelf in my room now, next to Chester's photograph, between the photograph and the lamp. Roy noticed it the first morning after I brought it back and said nothing about it. Roy understood which things required comment and which did not, which was one of the reasons I trusted him. March came. The east garden woke the way gardens do in early spring, everything pushing up after the long preparation underground, the bare canes from last fall putting out the first cautious green. The pale yellow azaleas I had chosen 3 springs ago, the same ones Carol had photographed on the Cloverfield brochure, and carried to my living room in November. I was at the east window with my coffee the morning the first buds showed. Sandra came to the doorway and looked at me looking at them. She said, "They're early this year." I said the root system was well established. When the root is right, the plants come early. They have more to draw on. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the garden. Then she said, "It was a very good meeting." I told her it was 20 years of correctly filed documents and one man named James Hobart and 17 years of work by herself and the staff of this facility, and that luck was not the word for any of it. She said no. But something brought you to that fence with a phone number on a gray afternoon. Something brought me to a law firm conference room to shake your hand and say, "Tell me your vision." Something makes certain people point their lives at a thing that needs doing and stay pointed at it until it's done. I looked at the azaleas in the early March light, coming back. I said, "Chester would have called it being sensible." She said, "What do you call it?" I looked at the photograph on the nightstand. First summer. The squinting smile. The young man who found the wrench. I said, "I call it knowing what you have before you can make anything of it. And then taking the time to make something of it right." Sandra nodded. She looked at the garden a moment longer, and then she went back to her 3 simultaneous things. The azaleas came into full bloom by late April, the pale yellow variety, Chester's color, the ones I had chosen from the catalog. The entrance walk was as I had intended it to be, warm and specific and worth stopping for. In May, Genevieve introduced me to a man named Harris who had arrived at Cloverfield from a house he'd lived in for 50 years, and was still sorting out how he felt about that. She introduced us on a Thursday morning over pastries with the natural authority of someone who had been at a table long enough to know who belonged at it, and who needed to be shown in. Harris asked me if I was new. I told him I had been here about 7 months and it had started to feel ordinary, and that ordinary was better than it sounded. He looked at his coffee and said that sounded right. Dennis called on a Sunday in June. He called instead of texting, which was a return to the Sunday call rhythm we had kept for 19 years, which had stopped in October and which he was now resuming, and which told me something about where he had arrived. He asked how I was. I told him fine, genuinely fine, that the pastries were excellent and Genevieve had found me a good puzzle and the East Garden was in full bloom. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said Carol had asked him to tell me she thought I should keep the Birchwood house. She had called it an asset that would appreciate and said the taxes were reasonable given the size. I said that sounded like Carol. He said she had also asked him to tell me she thought the facility was very well run. I said I knew. He had told me. She had called it excellent. He said yes. She had also said she didn't understand why I would want to live there when I could live at Birchwood, but that she supposed it was my business. I said it was. Yes. A pause. Then Dennis said, in the voice he used when he was getting to the actual thing rather than the approach to it, Mom, I'm glad the place is good. I'm glad you built something good. I should have asked about it sooner. I said yes. He should have. He said he knew. I said, Dennis, come for the pastries on a Thursday. Bring Carol. There is room at the table. A longer silence. Then yeah. All right. I said good and set the phone down. The house on Birchwood is holding itself, which houses do when they are built right. I have not decided what to do with it, and I will not decide before I am ready, and I will not be rushed about being ready by anyone, because I have not been rushed about anything in 20 years and I am not going to start now. The question that people ask about a house is always whether it is for sale, because the market has trained people to understand a house as a transaction rather than a place. I understand it as a place. 40 years of mornings in that kitchen, 40 years of the October light and the drawer chester installed and the window he replaced in the second year. The house on Birchwood is a place, and it will remain a place until I decide it should become something else, and that decision belongs entirely to me and will be made in the right order. The trust is in order. The documents are filed. The facility runs well, which it has for 17 years and which I intend it to continue doing under Sandra Lim for as long as Sandra Lim wants to run it. James Hobart answers on a Saturday morning. Kevin calls on Sunday. Patty brings practical things and stays long enough to say the real thing, and comes for the Thursday pastries now with a regularity that Genevieve has incorporated into her table expectations. Dennis is learning to ask instead of assume, which is the most hopeful thing I know about him, and the most hopeful thing about Dennis is that he is still capable of being changed by information when the information is clear enough. Carol called Cloverfield excellent and is working in her Carol way toward understanding what that means for everything she had assumed before she said it. My days at Cloverfield have a quality I did not expect when I designed the place, and which no one could have told me about from the outside, which is the quality of a day that belongs entirely to the person living it. I wake early because I have always woken early, and the east light is there by 6:15 in midsummer and later in December, and I read and have coffee and look at the garden depending on what the garden is doing. I take a walk around the grounds most mornings, the circuit that passes the red oak at the southwest corner. It is a very large tree. I always stop there. I know when it was standing in a field before this building existed. And I know what it looked like that November morning when James Hobart and I drove out and stood in the cold, and I understood what I was going to do. The oak has no idea what has happened since. It has just kept doing what oak trees do, growing and settling and developing the kind of root system that takes the first frost hard and the second frost without comment and the spring freeze as an expected thing to be absorbed and converted. I find this instructive and I stop there most mornings. Roy noticed early on that I stopped at the oak. He had a bench installed at the base of it the following spring, cedar well made, set at the angle that catches the morning sun. He said it was for any resident who wanted to sit out there. He said it in the tone of a person who knows who the bench is specifically for, and is being professionally tactful about the specific nature of their courtesy. I thanked him. I use the bench most mornings when the weather allows. The oak doesn't mind. It has been growing for longer than I have been alive, and it will be growing after I am no longer here to sit beneath it, which I find not sad but simply accurate. The way accurate things are often more restful than the versions of them that have been softened for comfort. James Hobart comes out to Cloverfield for our quarterly meetings now rather than having me drive to the county seat. He sits in the second chair, the kitchen chair. Patty brought a larger pot for the rosemary to sit beside, and we go through the trust reports and the Cloverfield operational summary and whatever questions have arisen since the prior quarter, the same steady rhythm we have kept for 20 years. He is 64 now and his hair has gone the gray of a man who has handled other people's important things with care for a long time. He looks at the east window every time he comes and says nothing about it, which is the right response to a window that is exactly what it was meant to be. There are things I did not plan for and things I could not have planned for. Harris and Genevieve. The specific quality of the Tuesday afternoon light in the common room, which I specified the window placement for but which arrives differently than I imagined it would, warmer, with a quality of resting in the room rather than passing through it. The way a well-built place acquires a character over time that is not the sum of its specifications, but something that accumulates from the people who live in it, the habits and rhythms and small presences that fill a space and make it theirs. I built the specifications. The people who live here made it what it is. That is always how it works. The builder sets the conditions and the conditions are either right or they are not, and if they are right the thing becomes itself over time, the way a garden becomes itself when the soil is prepared correctly and the plants are chosen for the ground they are in. The soil was right. The plants were right. The facility became itself. So did I, in ways I did not expect and could not have planned for, in a room with east windows I specified, in a building I founded, in a life I made from the particular materials I had after Chester died, which were grief and time and a pension and a modest inheritance and a teacher's habit of observing the room before deciding what to do about it. I made the right things from those materials. Not quickly, not without error, but in the right order, which is what Chester meant when he talked about doing work correctly, which was that you had to do each step before the next step, and that the quality of the final thing was held inside every step that came before it, and that patience was not a virtue separate from the work but was the work itself taken slowly enough to be done right. The wrench is on the shelf. The rosemary is on the windowsill, already outgrowing the pot again because rosemary grows toward whatever room it has. Chester is on the nightstand. And the east light every morning comes through the windows I specified at the angle I planned for, and lands on the floor of a room I designed for exactly this. For someone who had worked long and done it carefully to come home to herself at the end of the work, and find that the place she had built was the right one, and the life it held was the right size for the living of it. That was my story. 1 vote in a living room. 4 cups of coffee. A brochure with my own flower beds on the cover. 20 years of November mornings and correct documents in patient building. A facility my family chose for me because it was the finest in the county, which it was because I had made it so. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours, and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.